Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to this session. What next to immigration? We're now going to focus on the challenges for asylum and refugee protection. I'm Sundar Katwala. I'm the director of British Future and I'm chairing this session of our joint conference with Bright Blue. Got an excellent panel to take on these issues. We'll hear from David Simmonds, who's the MP for Ruislip, Norwood and Pinner, and has a long career in local government dealing with these issues. Dame Sara Thornton, who's the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner after a long career rising to the top of the police force. Enver who's the new director of the Refugee Council, one of the most important institutions in refugee protection in this country going back many decades. Arten Llazari of the Refugee and Migrant Centre, a powerhouse in Wolverhampton and the Black Country in dealing with these issues, and a lot of experience of the Windrush issues and bringing those to the public attention, as well as refugee and asylum issues. Professor Alexander Betts from the University of Oxford, formerly director of the Refugee Studies Centre, and he was the co-author of Refuge with Paul Collier, his proposals for reform. And just to kick off the discussion we're trying to have today, what next for immigration is a very big question. There have been big changes in the way the public is thinking about immigration, and we've seen a reduction in the salience and a warming of attitudes towards immigration generally, and that has perhaps created some space for constructive approaches to immigration. An interesting question for this panel, I think, is whether we're now going to see an increase in public or political or media focus on this question of asylum and refugee issues, again, as the place where the more contested issues of immigration now take place. That was true, I think, if we go back 20 years, 2001, 2005, the immigration debate was mostly about asylum for a long period. I think we've had a debate about immigration quite more focused on work migration and European migration since the enlargement of the European Union. Around 2015, we saw a very high focus on immigration of both kinds, the Brexit debates, but also the refugee crisis across Europe. We've had sympathetic and concerned responses about refugee protection over the last few years. And now we have a new points-based system after Brexit, which we've been discussing this morning, but the government proposing new reforms on asylum and refugee issues. So today, this afternoon, we're going to be discussing what are the drivers of asylum seeking, how is the UK trying to respond, how should the UK respond, and how could we try and perhaps get a political and a public consensus on how we respond to these issues. David, it'd be great to hear from you first on those issues.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sundar. Can I just check, can you hear me okay? Fantastic, thanks for the thumbs up. Well, look, thank you very much indeed to Bright Blue for the invitation, for organising this. It's a really timely opportunity to be having this discussion, not least because for the first time in around a decade, we've got a government with a fairly significant majority. So it's therefore in a position to drive through changes in our asylum and immigration policy. And that's something which we haven't really seen a government take a significantly fresh approach to for quite a long time. And with the upcoming sovereign borders and the wider debate about what global resettlement looks like, clearly this is the time to be having the conversation. I'm going to focus in my brief scene setter on three main issues: global resettlement, the need to join up government policy, and touching on the international rule-based system. But for me, I think the key thing at this point is to be thinking very much not about the technicalities of the migration system so much as to be thinking about what are the principles, what is the policy direction that we want to set. And one of the perils, I think, of the political debate is we can end up very focused on the short-term impact of particular issues. In recent years, we've had the impact of Windrush and the Wendy Williams review. We've seen the consequences of the Syrian resettlement scheme following the situation in Syria. But actually, we're in an overall context where the refugee and asylum policy that we have is one that has its origins in the late 90s, early 2000s, when people who were asylum seekers began to have a very specific status, and the hostile environment that we talk about today has its roots in that period. As perils of working from home.
We'll see if David can battle through that that noise if he reappears. We're just almost at the scene setter there,
right.
David, apologies,
there should be a window of quiet. Thank you. So forgive me if I've interrupted anybody coming back. So yeah, so I think the need to recognise that, particularly the hostile environment, the decisions that were taken in the early 2000s, for example, to remove access to benefits that were part of the mainstream system and to give refugees very specific status, the implementation around 2005 of asylum dispersal, are all things which have contributed to the way in which the debate today goes on. And I think it's really, really important that we recognise that longer term context, because what we put into legislation today isn't just going to be about the implications for the rest of this parliament, it's going to be about things that have an impact for the next 20 and 30 years. And starting off with the question about global resettlement. Firstly, I think the principle that the UK is setting out, as we did with the Syrian resettlement scheme, that we want to have an agenda to play a part in the world that says we will work with the likes of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to identify the most vulnerable and to offer them resettlement into the UK where they will be safe and they'll be part of our society. That to me is a big positive. And the feedback from communities, from organisations that have participated in it about the Syrian resettlement programme has been extremely positive and certainly markedly much more constructive than the feedback that we get about asylum dispersal. So I think recognising that a resettlement agenda is an important part of that and is a thing to be welcomed is vital. Now, clearly there are questions about the extent of that ambition and about what it means in practice. For example, is the UK going to seek to play a bigger role in resettlement in parts of the world like South America, parts of Africa, where we haven't historically had a significant political or other engagement? How are we going to balance that across the whole of the world? And are we going to be an equal partner in the way that the UN High Commission operates? Or are we going to coordinate that much more closely with our allies? So for example, the United States might play a bigger role in some areas, European countries might play a more significant role in others. So understanding and getting to the detail of what the global resettlement scheme means in practice for me is the first thing that we need to do. The second thing, and this is further downstream, but it's absolutely vital if the UK is going to continue to have the community goodwill about refugee resettlement. And that's making sure that our own government is much more joined up in the way that it approaches refugee and asylum issues in the United Kingdom. And examples of that, probably the best is the no recourse to public funds policy, where the political message is that people are allowed to be here, provided it's not at the expense of the taxpayer. But in practice, what happens is that those costs are picked up by local authorities, a different group of taxpayers, but still support from a part of the British state. And there are lots of other examples, for example, the way we treat child refugees as they make their journey through the system, where there are inconsistencies that create great difficulties both for the individuals and also for different parts of our system in how we support people. So making sure that across housing, across education, that we are working together so that people's journey through that system is smooth and we don't create any degree of community backlash because people perceive things as being unfair is absolutely critical. And then the third area I wanted to touch on was what the UK future role is going to be as we look at the international rules-based system, how we influence the way in which that operates and how we play a part in it alongside our allies. Having been in the Dublin system, something which clearly was an agreement amongst EU member states, and we know in recent years that that was more used for people to come to the UK than for people to leave it, it's absolutely critical that we have an international rules-based agreement with a basis that everybody understands and shares to ensure that we treat refugees fairly. And the debate that's going on at the moment about the government idea of having a third safe country policy whereby people who've been refused status in the UK but can be sent to another place where they are safe, but not in the United Kingdom, is a really good example of the complexity of that debate. And at present, there isn't really a proper sovereign body of international law on which we can rely, which sets out what people's expectations are of how refugees should be treated. We have this complex web of international systems interacting with UK human rights law. And we need to make sure that whatever policy we put in place through this new legislation, it's policy that will stick, because there will be huge frustration if we see something implemented that then falls over at its very first judicial review, because simply the legislation is not compatible with other elements of international human rights law, or indeed UK domestic law. So getting it right and understanding clearly what people's legal rights are and how those legal rights will be played out is absolutely critical. I'm going to finish, Sunda, with an observation, which I think is one about the whole debate, rather than any specific example of that. And that's something where I think it's critical that we need, as a community of people with an interest in asylum and refugee issues, we need to stop talking to ourselves about it. I attend a lot of these conferences, and what I tend to find is the same group of people with the same shared interest. And actually, as a Conservative Member of Parliament, I'm very conscious that I have a lot of colleagues who are interested in this issue, but the reason for their interests are very, very varied. I'm interested because I served a long time as a lead member for Children's Services in the local authority that looks after Heathrow Airport. My first encounter with the system was the 2003 Hillingdon judgment that clarified the rights of child asylum seekers in the UK. And therefore I've been on that journey with my community, with my local authority. I'm also conscious I have colleagues who've served in our armed forces in countries like Afghanistan, who have a real detailed understanding of what the issues in country are that may lead people to seek asylum in the UK. So they bring an interest based upon that experience. There are others who have particular communities that are supporting refugees, sometimes charity organisations in their constituencies. I think we need to make sure that we take this debate within Conservative circles and parliamentary circles generally, but within Conservative circles in particular, far wider, because if a government with an 80-seat majority is going to be convinced that it needs to get the nuances right on these things, then we need to make sure that there's a widespread community of voices making that case, rather than, as I may come to be seen, one of the usual suspects.
Thank you, David. I know you'll have to leave us before we get to a lot of questions. I'd just like to ask you one thing about just that last remark there. We've got a reduction in the heat of the immigration debate, but we might be having a more polarised asylum debate because there's new legislation. What do you think people in your party and people outside your party and civic society could do to kind of counter that polarisation and open up space for this kind of agenda?
I would suggest the most important thing is to get as much information out there, as many facts out there as possible, because the reality is the UK is not a particularly popular destination for asylum seekers, especially in the context of Europe, and we are mid-table at best. Actually, the global resettlement scheme is something which has been very well received by the communities that have participated in it, which is pretty much the length and breadth of the country. But the numbers coming in through that are quite small. So the big picture is that the impact of refugees specifically and migration generally on a lot of parts of the UK is quite modest. A constituency like mine in Outer London has resettled waves of refugees over many, many years. It's a very diverse place, in particular, a very large population of European Jewish people who fled following events around the time of the Second World War. But actually, if we talk to colleagues around the country and ask, what is the evidence of the negative impacts that you might expect to see based upon some of the media discourse about migration, often that impact is very, very small. And when I think of my inbox since I was elected, we hear a lot about controlling migration. Pretty much the only emails and contacts I've had from constituents about specific refugee cases have been asking me to intervene to stop people from being removed from the UK. And I know for colleagues, the same will be true, that most people's view of refugees is they like all the refugees that they know, they like the ones in their community, they like the ones in their neighbours, they like the ones at the doctor's surgery, like the ones who are the other parents at their children's school. It's just all the others they're worried about. And we need to bring home to people that they are all the others, that we're all just human beings. And in this system, the key thing we need to get right is to build that knowledge, that understanding of what those wider circumstances of people are, so that people are no longer afraid. And when that fear can be taken away, I think we'll have a much more constructive debate about how we approach the UK's place in terms of migration and refugees generally.
Thanks, David, for opening this session. Audience members have got a Slido link, and after we've heard from our panelists, I'll be putting some of your questions to them. So do share your questions. Chance to now move on to Dame Sara Thornton to tell us about how your work as the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner might be influenced or affected by the kinds of reform debates we're having at the moment.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. And as you said, I'm going to talk about immigration and asylum in particular with reference to modern slavery and human trafficking, because the announcement of the new plan for immigration did provoke quite a degree of concern in the sector about what the impact might be on slavery and trafficking. And so as part of my role in being independent and objective, I've spent some time listening to those concerns and looking with care at the proposals. And my conclusion is that there are two risks that I'm worried about. The first is that the proposals, if we're not careful, could make it harder to identify victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. And of course, I'd be concerned about that. But the other concern is that they may create greater vulnerability for people who might then end up in slavery and trafficking. Now, I think both of those risks can be mitigated, and I will try and persuade you this afternoon that that's a good idea. I will say at the beginning that some people in the sector have said, why on earth in a plan for immigration does it mention modern slavery? And I think the reality is there is an overlap. The data makes that quite apparent. In terms of the 10,600 potential victims of modern slavery identified in 2020, 32% were identified by either immigration enforcement, border force, or UK visas and immigration. So that for me just illustrates the substantial overlap. So in terms of what's needed, we know always that criminals and traffickers in particular will exploit any opportunity in new legislation. And so I would really urge that when we think about this bill, that the protection of the vulnerable is absolutely front and centre of the proposals. When the government announced the points-based system last year in February 2020, they talked about protecting individuals from exploitation by criminal traffickers. And I would really hope that we could see that sort of commitment to protecting the vulnerable in all these changes that are being proposed and will be debated. The second thing that I thought was really important about the plan, and it really echoes the work we do in terms of survivors of slavery and trafficking, is the importance of refugee integration and recognising the importance of helping people to live lives of sustainable independence. That is a constant theme in my work with victims and survivors of slavery and trafficking. Education, employment are absolutely essential to people's recovery, and really importantly, to prevent re-trafficking in the future. Last week, in fact, we published a report with the University of Nottingham about the need for the Home Office victim care contracts to be really focused on what is a work preparation curriculum, how can we develop strategies for reintegration. So I think that focus is really important and would do so much to help victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. The third point is around the hub of this issue about what are the risks, and it's the risks in proposals for an expedited process, for the one-stop process, and how they deal with the real trauma that victims of modern slavery and human trafficking will have suffered. This sense that people will be able to recall everything that's happened to them with clarity and consistency is just not the case when people are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. We know medically that if people are suffering from PTSD, the fight or flight response, we all know, they will make that response even when they're not under threat. They will have really poor memory retrieval. They can have a really kind of disproportionate response to things and will be suffering from stress and anxiety. And so it's just a real ask for the system to acknowledge the fact that when We know medically when trauma is involved, things like expedited process, one-stop process will be really difficult. We need to think about what is the way to mitigate the risks that people will be overlooked and justice will not be done. And the fourth point I'd want to make is this point about the extent to which, if we're not careful, the proposals could increase vulnerability to exploitation. And it's picking up a little bit on the point that David made about no recourse to public funds, because it looks like the suggestion that it will be a group of people whose claims are inadmissible but can't be returned and won't have recourse to public funds. And I know from all the work that we've done that that group of people in particular are hugely vulnerable to work for people illegally, but really are very vulnerable to all sorts of unscrupulous employers and traffickers. So just think about how so the unintended consequences might create more vulnerability. And I think, as David said, the point for me is it's just one of principle. The government are bringing forward these proposals. It will be for you, the experts, to say whether they're good in terms of immigration and asylum. What I'm just saying as the independent anti-slavery commissioner is, can we have the protection of the vulnerable at the heart of this bill? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I mean, we talk, and politicians talk about control and they talk about compassion, and you're very much at the sharp end of whether those two things can be combined in terms of seeing the human beings, that the policies are there to help and serve. Enver Solomon, the director of the Refugee Council, it'd be great to have your contribution.
Thanks, Sunda, and it's really good to be here. And I commend you and Bright Blue for putting on this important discussion and for hosting the Home Secretary to hear what she has to say. I'm going to talk about three key points, really, in the time that I've got. One is around why refugee protection matters. The second is one just touching on some of the points that have been made about the new plan for immigration and really asking the question, is it going to make things better? And the third one is one about principles and the importance of the 4C principles of control, compassion, contribution, competence, and you could even add a fifth of cohesion as well. So why does refugee protection matter? Well, of course it matters, because it's woven into the fabric of this nation, if you actually think about it. And the Home Secretary touched on it this morning. She talked about, in her speech, the way that this country, across different prime ministers of all colours, ranging from Churchill through to Callaghan, Heath as well, previously, Blair, Cameron, they've all recognised the importance of refugee protection. She talked about the Jews that came here, fleeing persecution from the Nazis, the Hungarians, the Ugandans, her own family story, the Bosnians during the horrendous war in the former Yugoslavia, and then more recently Syrians following the horrendous conflict that has hit their own country. So this is very much about who we are as a nation. We have refugee communities woven right across our land. In fact, many of the people here speaking today, and many of those in the audience, will have refugee blood in your veins and in your family. The importance of refugee protection goes to the heart of who we are as a nation, and the contribution that refugees have made to this country over the 7 decades. And it's important to recognise that it's going to be 7 decades this July since we signed the convention and committed to the UN Convention on Refugees, 70 years from 1951 at the end of July. And that commitment has really shone through over the decades across governments. They haven't always got it right, but there's clearly been a commitment. And just think about the commitment in communities across the land, the grassroots commitment that exists across church groups. I remember stories in the 80s and 90s during the height of the horrendous civil war in Sri Lanka, of church groups giving sanctuary to those that were fleeing persecution and war. Think about the families today that welcome in refugees at home, that give a home to refugees and people seeking asylum whilst they're waiting for their decisions to be processed. That is what we're about as a nation, and that is why refugee protection matters to us. It matters to us because of who we are, what communities do, and it's very much a part of who we are. The new plan for immigration, I think, really challenges that, because if it doesn't sit comfortably with that, in my view, it risks, as we heard already, around creating a two-tier system. And we've already heard very eloquently from Sara Thornton about how it risks increasing vulnerability to exploitation. It means that people will be judged about whether they have a legitimate claim for protection based on how they travel to this country. And yet, if you think about how lots of people who are refugees and are contributing to this country today came here, they weren't able to always come here through safe routes. It wasn't possible for people in Afghanistan to walk into the UK embassy and to try and get a visa and to come here through a safe route. The reality is that it's always the case that people will have to take their lives into their own hands and find a way of coming to the UK. And we should recognise that. And just because they've had to put their own lives at risk, they should not be penalised for that. And if we are serious, and if this government is serious about opening up safe routes, then whilst not penalising and slamming our door in the face of those who come here through so-called irregular routes, it must also massively and significantly expand safe routes. David talked about the importance of resettlement. There's the importance of family reunion here, the fact that very vulnerable women and children come here and have a right to family life and to be reunited with their family. There's plenty of opportunities the government has to expand safe routes, but I fear, and I didn't hear this morning anything from my Home Secretary that allayed my concerns, that there will be a follow through on expanding those safe routes. And let's then just think about whether these new plans are actually going to work. Will they reduce the horrendous levels of delays and the backlog that exists in the system at the moment, with more than 3/4 waiting over 6 months and many waiting many years for a decision on their asylum claim? I don't think it will. I think if anything, it will make the system more inefficient, less effective, and will increase delay by introducing the status of temporary protection and the fact that we don't have bilateral agreements with countries to be able to return people. So if anything, I fear that the backlog and the delay in the system and the inefficiencies in the system will get worse. It's also important to recognise that deterrence in and of itself doesn't work. There's no evidence. The Home Office commissioned research over a decade ago looking at deterrence, and there's no evidence that if you make the system tougher, that it deters people from coming to this country. So the question around the principles that are driving this and this concept of asylum shopping, or that we've got to toughen up our borders, I just don't think hold water. And there's evidence sitting in the Home Office that recognises that. So finally, to sum up, what do we need? We need a system that is compassionate, and compassion means giving a fair hearing to those who arrive and get here to our country, a fair hearing on British soil, regardless of how they've got here. Of course, it means control. And of course, it means that if people don't reach the threshold for protection, then we should return them. But if we're going to return them, we need to create a system of return that works, that facilitates their return, and that provides a pathway and supports them to return. We also must recognise people's contribution and the importance of integration into communities. And that means that if you get refugee status, you need to be genuinely supported to contribute and to integrate into communities. For many people that get refugee status, the first official letter they get is an eviction notice, and they struggle to access benefits. We extend the hostile environment for those that get refugee status. And finally, we need competency and efficiency. And I would just finish with this final thought. You know, my parents were refugees in different ways. Many people's parents were refugees. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for our great British value of upholding refugee protection. But also the British public recognise, and when the Home Secretary talked about having a democratic mandate to welcome those who are in greatest need of sanctuary. I would just actually suggest that that democratic mandate is not as clear-cut as we always think of it. Of course, people are anxious and concerned about those coming across the channel on boats, but we also know from polling that 2/3 agree that the UK should protect refugees who are fleeing war and persecution. So I finish by saying that actually there is a democratic desire for us to welcome all of those who are in need of protection, not just those who are in the greatest need.
Thank you, Enver, and I'll hand on to Arten. You came to this country at the end of the last century, Arten. You've seen many rounds of these debates as you've worked on these issues to help others. Do give us your perspective.
Thank you, Sundar. And thank you for the assist also, because I would like to start by explaining briefly where my experience and expertise comes from. As you said, I've been in UK for just over 20 years, went through the system myself, and that process lasted several years, and also have worked continuously with the system throughout this period. Briefly about what I do. Now, RMC is a regional charity that I lead and employs over 80 colleagues. We assisted over 13,000 individuals last year. Why am I mentioning that? Because these people came from all different parts of the immigration system. And because of our expertise, we casework them through at the most crucial stages of their journey. I'm trying to say that the expertise has got a certain depth to it. Now, because of that experience, we have seen policy getting tougher every couple of years over the last 20 years. The end result is always clamping down on the most vulnerable. The Home Secretary repeated today that the asylum system is broken. Nothing new to me. I remember John Reid during his period in the Home Office in 2006 saying rather bluntly, rightly or wrongly, that it simply wasn't fit for purpose. So that approach is at least 15-year-old. Personally, I remain very skeptical that the system can be fixed and at the same time ensure that UK acts fairly and compassionately towards the most vulnerable. I'm very aware that I'm now repeating what the previous speaker said, but I know that from experience. Those who need sanctuary the most are never ever going to be able to come through, with very few exceptions, to come through the so-called regular routes. And I can understand to a large degree the temptation to fortify walls and to make sure that the borders are as safe as possible, but don't expect at the time the attempts to cross the Mediterranean or the Channel to stop. People will continue to die in the Mediterranean and the Channel. And at the same time, I'm aware because I can see what's happening in Southern Europe with the thousands of people dying in the Mediterranean. The more suffering we see, the more desensitized we tend to become to it. But I'm still going to ask whoever is listening to us today to try to imagine the journey of, let's say, a young woman from Eritrea or Somalia who travels from her country in East Africa across sub-Saharan Africa, reaches Libya, often would spend there many months, rather often suffer, manages to pay for that perilous journey across the Mediterranean, and then in small numbers, because most people that stay in continental Europe, will make it to UK. Now, what is being proposed, because the Australian model has been mentioned rather often in the last few months, what is being proposed that the chances are that that kind of person, once reaching UK, will be sent to a remote cold processing center, but that for all intents and purposes will be a detention center, and which is the Australian model, because if colleagues want to check what the Australian model means, they started with detention centers in something like 200 miles from the nearest inhabited center. Then it was outsourced, so to speak, to the small islands in Papua New Guinea. Now, unfortunately, many people in that situation cannot be returned. unfortunately, and that's the sad state of this world we live in, many people also would rather not be returned because many of us don't have any idea what it is to live in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Syria, or Somalia. But I dread to think how tough we have to be with these new arrivals for them to consider returning to the horrific regimes they struggle with back home. So again, the main worry I have is not our ability to be as tough as possible with new arrivals, but what it will do for us who will continue to live inside those walls. Because I grew up in Southern Europe in a small country, which was the European version of North Korea. Building walls around you, it doesn't just stop the world from coming in. It also changes your conscious, changing your soul, changes the way you interact with the world. And we may have to, for a start, our amazing politicians won't be able to lecture the rest of the world on human rights once we do that. But also, we'll have to explain our children why families are still dying trying to cross the channel, basically. Now, bringing a bit more to the reality of the last few years, as Sandra mentioned, it was the cases we used to deal with at RMC or our colleagues at Praxis, a London-based charity, who sparked the Windrush scandal. During that rather messy fallout that followed, politicians made repeated commitments to change the culture within the immigration system, and most importantly, declared rather often that they will make sure that we remember the faces behind the statistics and we don't just talk about cold numbers. It's not our experience. There is a difference, a big gap between public commitments and reality. For example, if you wish, you can check the several reports that say that it took at least 2 years for, after several decades of alienation, it took 2 years for the compensation scheme for the victims of the Windrush scandal to start getting any justice. I don't think we also have noticed any noticeable change in the working culture of the Home Office. Now, we'll have to wait and see what the new system will bring, but as we speak, and echoing what previous speaker said, I do not feel compassion towards the most vulnerable very high on the agenda. And I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you, Arten, for sharing your experiences. Professor Alexander Betts, you've been researching, writing, engaged with policymakers at the global level as well, and one of your many books, Refuge: Transforming a Broken Refugee System. How do you see the UK's debates given that international experience that you have?
Thank you very much, Sunda. As you say, I'm an academic, and a lot of my work is outward looking and global in orientation, focusing on the regions of the world like Africa and the Middle East that host the overwhelming majority of the world's refugees. Reflecting that, the main point I want to make is that refugee protection is not just a home affairs issue. It's a major global challenge that cuts across home affairs, foreign policy, and international development at the international level. And even at the national level, it cuts across housing, education, and social policies, we've already heard. The Home Secretary has obviously laid out a new immigration plan, and it includes a significant focus on asylum. And we've heard a number of very compelling critiques of that plan. But what I want to focus on is what I see as an important missing component of its approach, which is the question of how the UK engages with refugees and displacement on a wider global scale. Because I think we do a disservice to the topic of refugee protection when we bundle it up purely with an immigration plan, when we see it purely as inward-facing rather than both inward-facing and outward-facing. So I actually want to argue that Britain might consider adopting something like a national refugee policy as distinct from just an asylum and immigration policy. What I want to suggest is we need a more coherent approach that integrates both the internal and external dimensions of forced displacement and can give us a unifying national narrative and the kind of confidence to engage with the wider world on what isn't just a British issue, but is a global and defining challenge of the 21st century. And to do that requires us to move beyond the Home Office, to have a joined up approach across Home Office, FCDO, and elsewhere in government. So in the brief time I've got, I want to answer 3 questions. I want to talk about the why, the what, and the how of building a coherent, compelling British national refugee policy and see what people make of that as an idea. So why? I think the starting point is the numbers. Refugee movements and forced displacement will be a major strategic priority of the 21st century. We've got growing numbers of fragile states. Climate change, the economic legacy of COVID-19 will mean that on a global scale, numbers and needs will grow. Now, it's important to recognise the numbers of refugees reaching the UK or even Europe are tiny in proportion to the overall global population. In the year ending March 2020, the UK received about 30,000 asylum seekers. In that year, it offered about 13,000 people coming through the asylum route or the resettlement route, refugee or humanitarian status, compared to that big picture of some 27 million refugees around the world. And I think what's important is this interdependence between how the UK engages outwardly with the world on these issues and the needs that arise for onward migration to Europe and the UK. So our policies can't just be about sitting, waiting, and closing our borders. We have to be engaged in responsibility sharing, in international cooperation on the humanitarian front and the global resettlement front in order for our policies to be meaningful and effective. I also think a national framework is important to provide clarity in how we engage with multilateral organizations and other governments so that the sum of our contributions is greater than the parts. Acting unilaterally, acting in isolation is going to be much less effective than engaging multilaterally in international cooperation. I also think a national refugee policy framework can provide a unifying national narrative. It can help clarify and explain to the public why people in need of sanctuary come to the UK and why we historically have played that role that the Home Secretary alluded to in her rhetorically very compelling speech this morning. So what would such a policy framework look like? Well, I think a national refugee policy has to have 3 core strands to it. It has to focus on the 85% of the world's refugees who are in low and middle income countries. It has to focus on neighbouring countries, first of all, the neighbours of conflict and crisis states. And too much of our current external focus is on transit countries like Libya. Once people reach those countries, it's almost too late. We need to focus on the countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, that neighbour countries of crisis and conflict, and ensure that we use our overseas development assistance and don't cut ODA that targets refugees through humanitarian aid or the creation of job opportunities, employment opportunities. We've got to work towards refugee self-reliance around the world and have evidence-based policies. But the second pillar is the one we've heard about, which is resettlement and alternative pathways. Britain started to build a quite effective vulnerable persons relocation scheme. It's built in community engagement programs. It's starting to offer alternative pathways for refugee health workers to come from the Middle East and support our health service at a time of need, drawing upon the talents and skills that refugees can offer our communities. And those approaches, as well as the alternative pathways we've already heard about, like family reunification, like migration visas for work, really need to be expanded, including to other parts of the world. They're effective, there's widespread public support for them, we can do more. But the third pillar, of course, which is always going to be for relatively small numbers, is spontaneous arrival asylum. And I think there are good reasons when we think about the new immigration plan, why the safe third country principle, which is central to that plan, does not always guarantee adequate access to international protection. There are sometimes very good reasons why people can't access effective protection in a country before they come to the UK. And so asylum in the UK needs to remain available. Yes, public trust has been undermined in the asylum system, but that, as we've already heard, is often a consequence of our inadequate policies, our inadequate integration policies, our hostile environment, our inadequate response to the long-term undocumented migration population in the country. And I think if we focus on making that asylum system effective for people who really need it, effective as a route of last resort, it can support our national interest. It's not just important as a part of meeting our obligations under international law and meeting the needs of genuinely vulnerable people. Asylum and spontaneous arrival asylum are strategically important for signalling to countries around the world like Lebanon and Kenya that they too should admit refugees. Unless we admit just a few thousand people on a reciprocal basis, how on earth can we insist that really challenged countries like Kenya and Lebanon leave the door open? So my third question is, how can we do this? I think the idea of a new immigration plan should be complemented with a national refugee policy or similar, with a global outlook on forced displacement. And much of the content for that could derive from what we already do well and what we've done well in the past. The things to do with our proud tradition of sanctuary, our commitment to use ODA to build development opportunities for refugees around the world, our engagement with multilateral organizations, including on resettlement, and our innovation in areas like the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme. But packaging it, I think, offers an opportunity for an inclusive national narrative, joined up governance that goes well beyond the Home Office, and supporting some principles around what Britain's wider role in the world should be at a time when this will become a major defining challenge of the 21st century. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Alexander. I mean, the sort of optimistic note you strike there about the need, obviously, a lot of challenges and rising challenges, but the need to think about national responsibilities and local consent in a global framework. I'd like to stay on that theme that you've introduced and ask the other panelists to just respond to that. Where do you see the opportunities to link up a national and a multilateral response, and where are the real pinch points of that happening? I mean, part of the point about having control and sovereignty is everyone else has got sovereignty too, so you have to proceed by agreement if you're going to have multilateral frameworks. Sara, can I just ask you how have those tensions of sort of cooperation and national policies played out in your experience?
I think the point that Alexander makes about thinking about this as a cross-government strategy is something that I repeatedly say about modern slavery and human trafficking. In fact, one of the things that's announced in the new plan for immigration in chapter 6 is there will be a new strategy. And I was saying to the Home Office, can it be a government strategy rather than a Home Office one? Because the role particularly of SCDO, but actually lots of other parts of government, whether it's MHCLG, HMRC, DOP, to use all the acronyms in the world, but it's right across government. It's not just a security issue. It's much broader. So completely agree on that. A couple of thoughts in terms of multilateral cooperation. The first is, particularly in my world of modern slavery and human trafficking, there was a substantial amount of money as part of the ODA, the official development assistance aid, which was focused on modern slavery and human trafficking. And I'm afraid that the recent cuts to that are looking like they are, in effect, meaning that programs in many parts of the world will not be able to continue. And again, it's just an argument for you've got to be thinking about what you're doing in country upstream, not just in the juxtaposed checkpoints in Coquel and that kind of thing. So I completely agree that sort of multilateral thinking about the aid issue in particular. And the other part of multilateral cooperation, which is important in my world, is the whole point about law enforcement cooperation. Where I have a lot of support for what the Home Secretary is saying is that the traffickers, let's talk about small boats across the Channel. The people who are trafficking people across the Channel there, whether that's in lorries or small boats or whatever, they are organised criminal groups who have kind of loose affiliations across the globe. And we absolutely need to work much more effectively, UK with law enforcement colleagues in the EU, but also beyond that, because they are criminals. And the reason why they are either smuggling people or trafficking people, it's the same organised crime groups on the whole that are doing it. So again, another kind of plea for multilateral engagement. And in fact, to be fair, it does happen. I had very good briefings on the case of the Vietnamese people who ended up in the lorry. 39 people died. Excellent cooperation with both the French police and the Belgian police to mount that prosecution, and indeed pretty good collaboration with law enforcement in Vietnam, which of course is a very different sort of challenge because it's a communist country. But I do think we mustn't forget that there are unscrupulous criminals who will exploit any opportunity they get. And so I do think a key part of this as well is multilateral law enforcement cooperation.
Arten, has your experience been that the politics of cooperation get harder and harder, or are there ways to open up more cooperation?
Sundar, as we speak, all the key councils from the West Midlands are a bit at loggerheads with Home Office. We work with 3 different councils in the West Midlands, and we know very, very well how patchy the whole thing can be, because I believe the MP who opened the session said, you can make national policy, you can talk about no recourse to public rights, then what it ends up is the local authorities will end up picking up the pieces. Before it becomes a responsibility of local authority, it will be us picking up the human cost of that situation. On a national scale, I'm not sure if it's for me to talk, but you referred to us now enjoying our newly found sovereignty. The French will enjoy theirs too. The French have, rightly or wrongly, accepted that quite a lot of people coming through Italy will arrive in France, and some of them will want to join UK. The French will not go out of their way to stop these people. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but somebody who traveled that way, albeit 21 years ago, knows that the reality on the ground is what it is. So in that battle between our sovereignty and the French sovereignty, what is going to happen to these people who will still try to cross the channel? I hope both on a national scale and especially internationally, at least within Europe, we will have a different approach, because the going to be seen and making populist statements against the cliffs of Dover is not going to solve anything.
Thanks. Enver, how do you see how do you unlock the kind of cooperation that Alexander was hoping we could when there were these political drivers, as Arten's talking about?
It's really challenging, but the Prime Minister talks about global Britain, and global Britain has to be about global collaboration and seeking multilateral agreements, and I think I think there's a lot of sense in what Alexander says. Whether there is the political appetite to achieve those multilateral agreements, I'm not sure. I mean, you look how difficult it is on climate change, actually. And I think, whether there's the potential here to make the connection around refugee displacement and the climate change debate and the need for a more global effort to support in the neighbouring states where displacement is such a big issue. I think there is potential, but I think absolutely we need to make the case for that multilateral engagement and that approach if global Britain is going to play a contribution on the global stage on these issues in the way that I think many people in the Foreign Office believe that we probably should do and always have done.
Thanks. So several of the contributions we're getting, I was looking at these questions, are asking aspects of this question. So I'll just mention several of the international cooperation points that have come up, so you can choose which ones to come up to. Should the immigration and asylum system increasingly be taking into account those displaced by climate change? And how would that happen? John Featonby from the British Red Cross wants to know if the global compacts on migration, on refugees, can be successful in creating a better and more coordinated global response to displacement and migration, and what are the challenges? And another question from David Forbes, which is related, is should there be some kind of joint Home Office, Foreign Office committee that oversees a transition to a policy of engaging multilaterally. So several questions, and another linked one. Obviously, can't answer all of the details here, but they're all the same theme in a way, these ones. Dr. Ruveli Ziegler says, for safe and legal routes to make a difference, would the UK introduce humanitarian visas at embassies, consulates and borders, such as Calais? Does the panel agree, and could the government agree, might be another question. So Alexander, lots of questions about the details of how the kind of thing you're envisaging might or might not work.
I mean, these are all reasons why we need a sort of coherent outward-facing refugee policy, and indeed the governance frameworks for cross-ministerial collaboration to make these things work, and that refugee policy cannot just be in the hands of the Home Office. And I think if we could flesh out some of the challenges of the future as part of that national policy dialogue, we begin to answer some of this question. So climate change is going to be one of the defining drivers that amplifies the reasons why people are displaced from their homes. The World Bank estimates that by 2050, nearly 200 million people may be internally displaced as a result of climate change. Increasingly, some of those will have to cross international borders in search of the basic means to live. Governments will have to confront the question of under what circumstances people displaced partly as a result of environmental displacement receive forms of humanitarian protection. Now, those are questions that Britain needs a position on, that it has to join up with collaboratively in international cooperation. And so we need to know where we sit on those issues. Things like the Global Compact. Part of the engagement historically in multilateral debates has been through the European Union. Britain needs its position at the multilateral table on these issues. And hence it has to have a sense of how we strategically position ourselves and how we build behind that a unifying national narrative for outward international engagement. So I think we could unpack each of these in detail, but for me, they highlight that we've got to take this out of purely Home Office hands and make it a joined up, coherent and positive engagement at a multilateral level.
Thanks. Enver, it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. I mean, something like the Global Compact, I don't know what difference it has made, but certainly when British Future goes around the country and talks to people, we would not encounter anybody who knew there was a Global Compact.
No, I'm not sure even everyone in today's audience knew there was a Global Compact. It's not the kind of thing that people talk about, is it? Because obviously, you know, when the media is talking about a number of people coming across the channel every day, that's what they talk about. But maybe Alexander's point about reframing it and actually asking the question, well, why are these people trying to make these perilous journeys? And what should Britain, as a global nation with a very important foreign policy role to play, be doing about that? So it's looking about and focusing much more on the source and not just obsessing about our borders policy. And of course, there has to be value in doing that. I think there's the whole issue of humanitarian visas is absolutely one that we should be looking at, and it's one that you know many people have put to the Home Office and the government to think about, and humanitarian corridors. You know, if you think about the story of when David Blunkett was Home Secretary and we had the camp in Sangatte, and you know the attempt that was made there to do a proper census of all those people in the camp, and then actually what Labour did was it created a mechanism, not quite a humanitarian corridor, but it brought over a good few hundred of people who were in Sangatte, gave them economic visas, and many of them went on to contribute and work in the economy across the country. And the evidence, as I understand it, from that policy was that it was very successful. So absolutely, we should be looking at humanitarian routes for people to come here and humanitarian visas. It has to be one of the different approaches that needs to be considered as part of a broad approach to creating safe routes.
Arten.
I hope it will be considered. I do not feel there is any political appetite for it at the moment. The sad reality is that I am not sure we would have had a resettlement scheme if 4 or 5 years ago the horrible photo of a little boy on the beaches of Turkey had not become headline news all over the world, and then the British public the British public showed its decency and made the then Prime Minister David Cameron stand up at the House of Commons and declare that limited scheme. So short of something, and I really hope to not predict the future here, short of something rather sad happening in our borders, I do not feel any tokenistic gestures will happen anytime soon.
Thanks. So these points about multilateralism, also this language of safer legal routes, obviously is now used. It's used by NGOs, it's used by the government, and so on. But we've got to decide what we mean by it.
So I think, of course, if you're going to deal with the desperation of people, you've got to think about opening up safe and legal routes. And as somebody's already pointed out, there's very little detail on how that might happen so far, but it's something which people repeatedly refer to. Can I just make a couple of other comments on what colleagues have said? One of the things that I discovered last year in terms of the Global Compact on Migration, that I've only ever had conversations with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office about it, not the Home Office, which says something about whose responsibility it was. It's kind of a different set of conversations with a different set of people, which is, I think, to that point about, doesn't it need to be cross-government? And the point about multilateral, lots of people ask really good questions about multilateral arrangements, and I think probably all of us are instinctively drawn to them. I was listening to a really good lecture by Lord Ricketts a couple of weeks ago. He's just written a book called Hard Choices, talking about after EU exit, and as we get kind of different relationships with the US, China, India, to what extent is the UK going to lean forward into multilateral arrangements? Now, I would hope it does, but I think politically, as somebody said, let's see what global Britain means, and hopefully it does mean that, but I'm not certain that that's necessarily the case yet.
Thanks. Now, another cluster of questions we've got are around this, the language and the policies of fixing the system. And I don't think we've got many defenders of the system we've currently got on any side of the debate, but I think we can all mean rather different things by fixing the system. So questions that are being asked include some asylum seekers have waited for several years now. How do we fix the system for them? There's been little reference to detention so far today. Why is Britain alone in Europe in having indefinite detention? A restriction to 28 days would reduce costs. This is an anonymous question, but that's how they've put their question. And then a further question, is there any sight of any kind of amnesty for the people living in the UK undocumented for more than 10 or 15 years? It's an interesting point here because this is something the current Prime Minister believes in. He actually said so on the day he became Prime Minister. Again, it's something he believed when he was London Mayor, but it wouldn't necessarily be a thing you'd expect him to come forward and do politically. So just different questions there about how the system works in a more domestic sense. Enver, I might come to you first on these questions.
Yeah, I mean, on decision making, and the delay. I mean, there's a huge issue in the Home Office around just capacity. People power. The number of staff that was drastically cut back, and it needs to be massively increased because they don't have enough staff. They've been woefully resourced in this regard in relation to decision making. For those of in the audience and that have long memories, that the last time there was a huge backlog a decade ago, what effectively was done was there was rapid decision making in relation to particular cases from particular countries where they knew that there was a likely to be a clear, strong, sound claim for protection. That needs to be looked at again. There needs to be ways of making more decisions, quicker decisions in those cases on paper. I think there needs to be more specialism around decision making, so specialist teams. We need to, arguably, and this has been put forward before, we need to create an independent panel, an independent structure that's separate from the Home Office, to carry out decision making that would give better quality decision makings in quicker time with greater competence. So there's lots of mechanisms and means that can be put in place. I worry that the Home Office is not concentrating on that as much as it should be, and I hope they are looking at it. I think obviously on detention, we shouldn't forget that it wasn't that long ago that the then Home Secretary commissioned detention pilots, which were a whole range of pilots in collaboration with UNHCR to look at alternatives to detention. And there was one carried out up in the northeast, looking at women in detention, looking at mechanisms of not holding them in detention, holding them in the community. And I understand they're a big driver from that. And it came out of a review that was done by the previous prisons and probation ombudsman on this. The big driver for this into his review, Stephen Shaw's review into detention, was cost and the Treasury at the time. So, there's been a review that there were alternative proposals and mechanisms for alternative pilots. The government could really push forward with this and actually, really start taking forward that whole review and the evidence from those pilots, which is now emerging, to move away from detention, because really, there's no strong rationale for it, I don't think. And finally, in relation to an amnesty, well, we know what Boris Johnson, when he was Mayor of London, around an amnesty. We know what's happened, and the lesson that what's happened in the States under Obama. I know that there are, as David said previously, David Simmonds MP, that the whole issue for local authorities around no recourse to public funds and people that are left in limbo, existing on the margins and the shadows of society. We need to find a way to resolve this. And there are pros and cons for an amnesty. It absolutely should be looked at, but most critically, we should look at moving swiftly to reform the horrendous and damaging and brutal policy of no recourse to public funds.
Thanks. Arten, decision-making, delays and so on.
Not sure I can add much more to what Enver just said. The last amnesty that was called an amnesty was a limited exercise David Blanket did over 15 years ago for families. The exercise Enver referred to, I believe at the time it was called clearing the backlog of legacy cases. And I do not think, again, there is appetite for an amnesty as we speak. If the current PM, who seems to be very popular within his party, is willing to, he better do it sooner rather than closer to the elections. But as for decision making in the Home Office, compared to the system I knew 15, 18 years ago, the times have decreased, but also my understanding the drive is for processing centers, ideally offshore, where people can be kept for lengthy periods of time, because that should serve as deterrent for others to come here, which is again the infamous or famous Australian model. And Europe is considering with Libya. I very much hope we do not go down that road.
So yeah, there's a real clash potentially between the pace and the humanity. So that was one of the things you were saying in your opening remarks, I think.
So if instead of improving the system, we just make an extremely blanket approach of being very, very tough with all people who arrive here independently, because we need to spread the word across the world, the word across the planet that do not even bother to come here, then I don't think a fair system will enter the picture whatsoever.
Thanks. Sara, did you want to come in on that?
Just a couple of points specific to victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. The point about waiting for asylum decision making is absolutely correct, but we've got to remember that victims of modern slavery have already been in an earlier Home Office decision making process, which is taking an average of over a year. So I'm particularly concerned there's not just a wait for an asylum decision, there's been a wait for a trafficking decision before that. So that's particularly pernicious. The second point on immigration detention, until in fact this month, if a potential victim of modern slavery was identified in immigration detention, they were mostly released under modern slavery guidelines. Victims of modern slavery have now been brought within Stephen Shaw's adult at risk policy, which means I suspect that more will actually stay in immigration detention. That apparently is not the purpose of the policy change, but we'll be keeping a careful eye to make sure that's not the unintended consequence, that you end up with more victims of crime kept in immigration detention, which I would regard as even more serious than the general concerns about immigration detention.
Thank you. Alexander.
Yes, the Home Secretary in her keynote this morning mentioned the very high cost of the asylum system. And I suppose part of that stems from the investment in the deterrent system. Aspects of the deterrent system are extremely expensive. Detention centres, private contractors, the border control model is a big part of that expense. Actually admitting 15,000 people who you give refugee status to each year, ensuring their integration, is probably a relatively small part of that model. And I think one of the challenges for the asylum system is it needs to be much more evidence-based. I think historically there's been a lot of evidence that comes out of the civil service, including excellent research within the Home Office, and a tendency often for elected politicians to ignore that evidence and develop policy approaches that do not have an evidence base. So under what conditions are deterrence policies effective? It's an empirical question. There's some evidence that really questions the effectiveness, for instance, of the hostile environment, and yet it's been pursued and invested in. And as Arten said, offshore processing, like the Australia Nauru model, is not only terrible from a human rights perspective, but it's also exceptionally expensive. So I think the shift to an evidence-based model could be one that actually saves costs. We can learn what works, what's efficient, and what's effective, rather than thinking about labeling the whole thing as broken and costly, when some of the brokenness comes from areas which might be improved with greater respect for the evidence.
Thank you. The last thing I'd just like to ask each of you about as we close is the politics of this issue. It's a very political issue, and I suppose one of the things the think tanks are trying to do today is engage and grapple with the different political drivers. If we've got ideas for reform, we might need public consent. We certainly need governments and parliaments and local decision makers to act. So would like to hear your thoughts on the challenges we have in this parliament. We've got 2 or 3 contributions that relate to this point. My colleague Steve Ballinger says paying greater attention to the integration of refugees and asylum seekers in the UK would help people. Would it also help to shift public attitudes and create more political space if we focus more on integration? And a couple of comments responding to the discussion of things David said right at the start. How can wider conservative circles of opinion be re-engaged in these debates? How do you engage with those concerns without reinforcing misperceptions of the issues, is the question that's been put. And a final thought on this, David Simmonds talked about people liking the refugees that they know, which rings true. If the key then is removing fear from public debate, does the language of the government help or hinder that? So lots of different questions there about the politics of this moment, how you create space for reform. Sara, you won't give a very political answer, but give me your thoughts on the climate of debate and how we make progress within it.
Your question's got red lights flashing all over it for me. Do you know something? I would go back to the point that David made about whether people's views are changing. And I would say in all my experience, both as a police officer and at this role, that when people get to know folk and see them as their fellow human beings, they're much more sympathetic. So that sense in which to encourage a greater public debate, which is informed by people, people's neighbours, their relations, I think, could mean that the politics could move on because people, there are some signs that people's views are beginning to change. So ever the optimist.
Thank you. Arten, you're always trying to make progress in tough times. How do you do it?
Ever so quickly, and aware that I'm stating the obvious, I very much hope this kind of event will be one of many and not an exception. And I mean across the divide. Frustrated as much as I could possibly be with the fact that rather often we all stay in our echo chambers. Not you, Sunda, but many of my colleagues do. And then we end up preaching to the choir. And I also, it's not for me to be so patronizing, but I'm also very, very, very aware that the largest majority of people concerned about migration are not xenophobes or racist. So on those bases, I just hope we'll keep talking to each other.
Thank you. Alexander.
Refugee protection should be a unifying issue across parties, across political starting points. I mean, if we think about Britain's proud tradition in this area that we've spoken quite a lot about, both major parties have shown leadership on this over the last 100 years. I mean, we can go back to even 1958, Chris Chataway persuaded the Conservative government to lead something called the first ever World Refugee Year. And it raised huge amounts of money and was a huge multilateral initiative that transformed lives around the world. This can and should be something unifying. In the US, for instance, refugee protection has always been something that both the Democrats and the Republicans got behind. I think we need to see that as a starting point. But it's an area that requires leadership. I think too much of the time, different politicians use different language and often confuse the public and undermine public confidence. I think the public often thinks, well, if politicians are arguing over the facts, who should I believe and what should I believe? I think the more this is an evidence-based debate, the more there's agreement on the principles, agreement on the language, and we have at least a common language to debate and discuss these issues, the more civil the terms of the conversation will be, and the more the public will be able to get behind it. And so I wonder whether we do need something that's a bit more structured, a bit more coherent. And that's one of the reasons I am partly interested in this idea of a national refugee policy and possibly pulling together a cross-party, a diverse in composition national commission that could start thinking and reflecting about some of these issues. So it's not just coming from the Home Office, it's not just coming from the government, but we've got a range of voices from across society, from different backgrounds, thinking about who we are, to Enver's point, who we want to be, and what position Britain plays in this area. But I think the politicization of refugee protection is a tragedy, unnecessary, and it could and should be much more unifying than it is.
Thanks. Enver, I'm giving you the last word.
And not necessarily the easiest one. I think we have to reach across the political divide. Absolutely. I think what is most alarming about this for me is the increasing polarization. We have to find a common ground. And I think, what we've just heard there from Alexander, reminding us of the Conservative Party back in 1958, and recognizing that there is a strong strand of compassionate conservatism. And we have to find a broad-based agenda, a broad-based network of support that is across the political spectrum to unite behind that concept of a compassionate approach, and that unite behind the concept that refugee protection is who we are. And we have to also recognize and engage with people's fears. We have to engage with people's fears that are real. The fears that exist in the so-called Red Wall constituency, the fears that people have when they see images of boats coming across the channel. And we have to encourage our politicians to engage in the drivers behind those fears and not just in the fears in and of themselves. So if those fears are driven by economic insecurity, to encourage them to focus on the economic insecurity and not just simply a reactionary, more aggressive, hostile, pull up the drawbridge approach. Because I think focusing on the drivers and recognizing people's fears is an important part of what we need to do. It's not always easy, and it's not always what we necessarily might want to do, but we have to engage with it if we're going to shift the political narrative.
Thanks. That's a good place to end. And it's not just political divides we need to cross. I think we can mobilize, but there are generational divides, there are geographic divides, there are social class divides, and we can mobilize at the most supportive end, but also perhaps bridge and mobilize. That might be the challenge for advocates on these issues, and to get the broad-based tradition that we've obviously had for 70 years when different parties have been in government, to take that forward into the future. Well, thank you very much to the panel for being here today. Thank you for the audience for coming. Do stay in touch with Bright Blue, our friends who I hope can help us build the liberal conservative case for British future, which is very non-partisan, so we'll be building a case with Conservatives and other parties as well. Do stay in touch with us about what you heard today and your ideas about how these things can go forward. Thanks again to Nomadic and the Federation of Small Businesses who helped to make this possible today, and do get in touch with us and let us know what you thought and how we can take these debates forward in future. Thanks very much, Sara, Alexander, Arten, Enver and David for your contributions, and goodbye everybody. Thank you.